Let's go!
I do want to talk about the biggest elephant in the room, because a lot of people are freaking out about this, and then some people seem like, oh, I want more, you know, other characters. Don't get me wrong, dude. Do I want to see Dudley and Makoto just as much as the other person? Yes, absolutely. Dudley is my #1 character I want to see come back to Street Fighter. I want Dudley and Sean more than any other character. And yes, I want to see Third Strike representation showing up in Street Fighter 6 with the way they're depicting characters. I think Elena's a really good call. She's not a Third Strike character, but, you know, still. There is Street Fighter characters that are not in this season, and half this season is taken up by Terry and Mai. I understand where some people are coming from, but I also think that you do not realize how significant this is. The cultural significance of this shit is astounding. Reason number 1, a Street Fighter game proper, a mainline Street Fighter game. We're not talking Street Fighter Cross Tekken, and we're not talking Marvel Superheroes versus Street Fighter. A mainline Street Fighter game has never had a crossover character outside of the Street Fighter universe. Let me explain. We talked about this a bit before with the Street Fighter Legacy a year ago. The Capcom IP has made its way into Street Fighter games at several points throughout the history of the mainline Street Fighter series, right? But in Street Fighter Alpha, it was the first big one where they just practically confirmed Street Fighter and Final Fight are together and they exist in the same universe, you know? So that was the first quote-unquote crossover. And yeah, it's a crossover, don't get me wrong. But at the same point, anything that happened from that point forward were characters that either were injected from Final Fight or potentially other franchises that were Street Fighter relevant. Like Project Justice, Sakura went over to Rival Schools / Project Justice. There was some crossover stuff that happened there. And there was some pretty crazy stuff with Zeku, and he became technically the first Strider type shit. All very cool things, right? Yeah, delving into Capcom IP to fill out the Street Fighter, you know, add a little bit more lore and legacy to Street Fighter in some way, which is cool. Everybody loved this, man. Everybody loved Akira in Street Fighter 5. That was one of the best characters they could have possibly done there. But Capcom has never, ever in the mainline Street Fighter series crossed over with other franchises. That was effectively saved for Marvel vs. Capcom, and that ain't looking so good. So what's happening now? This situation here, this happening is kind of telling of the situation that Capcom is in general with like their crossover franchises, because they've only had a couple of major ones, which is Capcom vs. SNK and, you know, technically the Namco RPG games, and obviously Marvel vs. Capcom. MVC isn't really going anywhere anytime soon. That isn't really going to be happening or turning into anything anytime soon. But there is space for Capcom and SNK to work together again, which makes a lot of sense. This hasn't worked out in nearly 20 years, right? Capcom and SNK actually working together. But at the same point, there is space for crossover to work here that might make a lot of people happy, and SNK is doing better than they ever have right now. The cultural significance of this is that it's a first time in Street Fighter history that Street Fighter is going to actually get guest characters. And I know some people will say whatever you feel about guest characters, but I'm more happy for the health of the game in general. Any fighting game is going to take a chance at making its core audience a little displeased at the trade of gaining a bigger new audience. And granted, SNK and Capcom share kind of similar audiences, not entirely identical, but they're classic 2D fighting game franchises that have existed for like 30 plus years. So of course it's going to feel like they sort of belong together in some way. And yeah, Terry and Mai and all these characters do feel like they've always belonged in Street Fighter in some way. Let's talk about specifically what we're looking at. This isn't City of the Wolves. That's not City of the Wolves Terry. That's like KOF Terry, which is very different than Fatal Fury Terry that is showing up in the near future. That's weird. Same thing with Mai. Mai's also not in City of the Wolves. This is the classic depiction of Mai / the KOF depiction of Mai. I do think they'll get a costume too with that stuff, but which depiction of the characters did they choose? They chose the old CVS ones. I'm entering conspiracy theory tinfoil hat territory where I'm just like, why would they choose this? Why would they end up going to the CVS route? Is it because that's familiar to us? And don't get me wrong, I actually think if Terry gets an alternate outfit, it'll probably be this outfit in City of the Wolves. Don't get me wrong. But it's the KOF defaults. And again, CVS was mostly like using KOF characters for their foundation when they started that series. Let's talk about leading up to this. Why was this also significant? This was EVO 2 years ago. And this was CVS effectively starting back again in the form of weird prints that showed up at EVO 2022. Capcom and SNK working together again. So this relationship doesn't just pop out of nowhere. This starts from a little project that got released on the Switch back in 2021. This exclusively released on the Switch a few years ago, 2021. So this was over 3 years ago now. The day this popped up, it was cheap. It was like a port of a great game that was on Neo Geo Pocket Color. SNK made this game, arguably one of the best handheld mobile games of this generation, right? Absolutely amazing game. I think it later came out on Steam as well. I think me and Simmons were telling everybody, if you guys give a shit about SNK and Capcom ever working together again on something big or significant, you buy this game right now. This was the beginning of it, because the only way this game gets released officially in some way was Capcom and SNK agreed. We can re-release this, right? And they did. You don't see that meaning much at the time, but I had to remind people, no, they had to shake hands on this shit. And before this, Capcom and SNK had not had a great history together. Let's go back way back to Capcom versus SNK 2. CVS 2 was a game that came out around the early 2000s. CVS 1 and 2 respectively was a deal between Capcom and SNK at the time, and they were going to take each other's franchises and work together and make their own games, right? So there was a deal. Capcom got the better end of this deal by a lot. They were able to pump out 2 games that were relatively successful, CVS 1 and CVS 2, and at the same time, SNK was almost going bankrupt. The company was not doing great. They were about to be absorbed by Playmore. The game they were able to produce is SVC Chaos, but it was done amidst a, absolute nightmare situation at the company. So really, this relationship got kind of soured from what I understand. From many people that I knew at Capcom in the late 2000s and the early 2010s, a lot of people were like telling me that we're close to these projects. Oh no, you ain't gonna get Capcom and SNK working together anytime soon. That was like over 10 years ago now. But still, it was a big thing that relationship was effectively soured back in the CVS days. You're not gonna get that shit. Granted, a completely different company. SNK is no longer with Playmore, like all that kind of stuff. This was a long time ago. When you start seeing shit like this happening at Evo and stuff like this happening 3 years ago, I'm like, bro, this means something. This is not just bullshit. This definitely means something. And then this dropped like a year later. This shit. Game with incredible artwork. It's actually friggin' amazing, but it's a card game. Don't get me wrong. So this came out a year later in 2022. The point of the story is that they released another game that required a lot of work that for no reason you would not need to put that much work into it, and it came out on some modern system a couple years ago. So SNK and Capcom would have had to put actual decent money into translating and doing everything you would need to in localizing a whole game. And they did it. So that happened a couple years ago again, where it was like, all right, so these guys are actually making new things together in some way. There were titles in here that had not been technically translated before that was also Capcom IP, but released by SNK. And it was like, yo, what the hell? There were years of these characters in Capcom and SNK working together just fine. I was not looking at that as being nothing. Now here's tinfoil hat thing. These aren't Fatal Fury characters. These aren't Fatal Fury models. These are CVS models. My brain is hovering around, I think this is the beginning of something. And the obvious route from this point forward, I don't think is an immediate, oh, they have the same design. Terry does not look like this in City of the Wolves, bro. And Mai is not even in City of the Wolves. These characters look like KOF versions of characters, much less CVS characters. What I'm saying is that I think the future of this stuff leads to a direction where, yeah, they're gonna make a big game together eventually. I think that's gonna happen, but I don't think that happens first. I think the first thing that happens is an actual collection. Capcom and SNK to produce a collection for CVS 1, CVS 1 Pro, CVS 2, and maybe CVS 2 EO, just for collector's sake, right? And also SVC Chaos, that's also pretty important. SVC Chaos Plus, maybe that's a thing. Those games need to be together, re-released in some way. That needs to fucking happen, man. And they need rollback netcode. It's the only problem is that Capcom has not released modern renditions of old Naomi games, and CVS is an old Naomi game. It's an old Dreamcast game technically, and so is CVS 2, so is Marvel 2, Project Justice. A lot of these old 3D games, and yeah, CVS 2, CVS 1 are 3D games technically. They have never been re-released. All I'm saying is that I think this is the beginning. The beginning was actually back when Capcom and SNK were like, producing new artwork together again. And now it's come to a head. Now it's like actually real. A collection, I think, is where you go from this point forward. I really hope that at some point this year, we haven't gotten a new fighting game collection in over 2 years, and usually Capcom releases a collection every 2-ish years. And we haven't gotten one yet. To me now, it's like, oh, bro, I think we're getting this shit. Whereas the actual future, I don't want Capcom making a Capcom vs. SNK game. I don't. Based on what we've seen so far of like City of the Wolves, and how fun games like KOF 15 are. I don't want Capcom making a CVS game if there's a future for these characters and these franchises to be together again. I do not. I want SNK to make it. And I think that is a better finality to the story we were talking about earlier. SNK got kind of screwed on their perspective of a Capcom versus SNK game back in the early 2000s. They got kind of screwed on that shit. I think it would be amazing if you give SNK Capcom characters to have fun with. The last time we gave SNK Capcom characters to have fun with, albeit the quality of the game might not be exactly what you're looking forward to. Last time we gave SNK access to the Capcom library of characters, it wasn't just a Street Fighter game. Mind you, a lot of Street Fighter characters, but we got a crazy roster. Red Armorer and friggin' Hugo and Zero was in this shit. We got a weird, crazy roster. It was a lot of Street Fighter, don't get me wrong. And yeah, CVS was also a bunch of Street Fighter as well. But dude, imagine an SNK made Capcom versus SNK game where they don't just stick to just Street Fighter. They don't just stick to Street Fighter 6. They don't just stick to this stuff. What if they actually like delve into the Capcom history of games a little bit more than just one side of it, which was the problem with the CVS series. This is where my hopes are of this entire situation. I desperately want SNK to make a future crossover game. If this eventually goes anywhere, I would love that to happen because I think it's a nice finality to this story. That's where I hope this stuff eventually goes. I think the first route of this entire crazy, this impossible shit is hopefully a collection of some kind. I really hope we get a CVS collection because CVS 2 is arguably one of the greatest fighting games of all time. And I really hope it leads to a point where these companies directly work together again and we actually get SNK to make a big CVS game or an SVC.